Hello, dear Celeste Siam de Miero and dear Association of Journalists of Mexico. I'm very happy to speak to you today on December 13th, and thank you once more for the fact that you have given me the award for freedom of expression. That means a lot these days because that freedom of expression is under attack. As a matter of fact, if you look around the world, about many countries are trying to control what they call the narrative. For example, just to give you one example, the EU, the European Commission, just put out guidelines to teachers in the schools, instructing them that they should debunk fake news for pupils, meaning, that they are not only correcting what they regard, or supposed to correct what they regard as wrong narratives, fake news, but they are supposed to inoculate the pupils with the true narrative. Now, this is an unbelievable assault on the ability of children to learn to think and have a judgment on how to differentiate between right and wrong. And that is just one of the many examples where, you see that the various institutions, intelligence services, and others are trying to control the information in the social media. So the freedom of expression is a good under incredible attack. And actually this cannot be separated from the fact that we are in probably the most dangerous moment in world history. And I'm saying that, because we are on the verge of a potential World War III, which would be a nuclear war. And if it would ever come to such a horrible event, it would mean the end of civilization, because if you have a global nuclear war, it is estimated by scientists that a global nuclear winter would follow of about 10 years. And in that time, basically everybody who has not died in the first hours would die of starvation in the following years. So that is very close, and naturally we are also extremely close at the more optimistic variant, a completely new world economic order. But first let me spend a couple of sentences on the danger. The reason why we are in such a danger is because it is not over Ukraine. Ukraine is just a pawn. The real issue is that the forces of the present transatlantic financial system want to keep control, and they are naturally extremely challenged by the economic rise of China, and they are trying to contain Russia, contain China. And that has been going on since the end of the Soviet Union, where you had a very hopeful moment. We called it at the time a star hour of civilization, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, there would have been the chance to establish an international peace order, which would have changed the entire world dynamic. But as we now know, the Anglo-American forces decided to try to impose an unipolar world and broke their promises given to Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. There were 5 NATO expansions instead. And basically with the coup of 2014 in Ukraine, the present escalation was set into motion. And it's not allowed to even discuss that there was a prehistory before the outbreak of war in February 24th of this year. But now something incredible has happened, and that is that the former Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, has given 2 unbelievable interviews, one to Spiegel and the other one to the weekly magazine Die Zeit, in which she admitted that really she never, and obviously also France, never had an intention to follow through with the Minsk Accord, And in that way, she confirmed what the former Ukrainian president, Poroshenko, had said just a week or two ago, namely that they never intended to implement the Minsk agreement and just were using this time to build up the Ukrainian military up to a NATO standard. And that was basically what Merkel confirmed. Now that is incredible. I think this is very serious because it means that, basically, what can you believe if a Western politician is saying something? And as you know, Germany and France were supposed to be the guarantors of the Minsk agreement, and we always criticized that they were not doing anything to enforce it. But now it turns out it was all a charade. Now, obviously, President Putin of Russia said that, now he feels that it was a mistake by Russia not to have militarily intervened in the Donbass in 2014 already. And there were hardliners at that time who had basically pushed him to do it. And Putin had set on negotiations and believed the promises of Germany and France that there would be a Minsk agreement. Now, I think this is really incredible, and it just means that all the attacks on the people who said that the Ukraine story is more complicated and it's not just Putin who is the evildoer, they are basically justified now, and I think this should be discussed appropriately in the international media. Now, this situation remains extremely dangerous because you have some frivolous people in official military places who have recently had a relatively loose talk about the use of nuclear weapons. The Russian various officials have now said one has to rethink the whole doctrine of Russia, that Russia will only use nuclear weapons if the existence of the Russian state is at stake, because in the meantime the United States has moved a lot of tactical nuclear weapons into Europe, many of them in Germany, and it takes only a few minutes for strategic bombers to carry these nuclear weapons inside the territory of Russia, and therefore we are again in a situation like it existed in the early 80s with the medium-range missile crisis, the Pershing II and the SS-20. And at that time, there were hundreds of thousands of people in the street warning that World War III was extremely close. Now these people are not in the streets, and that is a very big problem. And you can also compare the situation with the Cuban crisis, because, the vicinity of these nuclear weapons to the territory of Russia is only a few minutes. And just imagine what the United States would say if the Russians or the Chinese would have nuclear weapons along the Mexican-American border. So because we are in this incredibly dangerous situation, which, by the way, is driven by the fact that the financial system of the transatlantic world is coming to a final blowout, which you can see by the hyperinflation and the absolute paradox of the central banks. If they don't do anything and continue quantitative easing, hyperinflation will escalate. If they try to fight inflation with quantitative tightening, there threatens a collapse of many indebted firms, capital flight out of the emerging markets. So they're vacillating back and forth, but there is no solution within the system. Now, this is why I have proposed already quite a while ago that we absolutely must address this problem in a fundamental way. And I suggested a new international security and development architecture, which must take into account the security interest of every single country on the planet. Because otherwise, if you don't do that, it does not work. Now, the historical reference point is obviously the Peace of Westphalia, which ended 150 years of religious war in Europe. And after the 30 Years' War, which was the high point of that war, people realized if they would continue, there would be nobody left to enjoy the victory because everybody would be dead. And that's the situation comparable to today. So the Peace of Westphalia was extremely important because it established several absolutely important principles which were the beginning of the international law of peoples. Now, the first principle they arrived at was that for the sake of peace, you have to take into account the interest of the other. And I think I'm not telling you anything new, because this was the principle which was also emphatically stated by one of the greatest presidents of Mexico, Benito Juarez, who said that peace means the respect for the interest of the other, both in respect to other individuals and also in respect to other nations. And this is a very important principle, because when you take into account the interest of the other, you can build a peace order. That was the Peace of Westphalia. If you don't do that, like in the case of the Versailles Treaty, where, despite the complexity of the reasons why it came to World War I, Germany was basically said to be the only guilty party. And naturally that led to unjust war reparation payment, which led to the hyperinflation, which led to the Depression, which led to World War II. So if you're not just in your peace solution, it leads to new wars. The second principle of the Peace of Westphalia was the idea that for the sake of peace, you have to forgive the crimes of the one side or the other. Because if you keep, recounting, you did this to me, I did this to you, it will be an eternal loop and you will not end the war. And the third principle, which was very important, that in the reconstruction of the post-war situation, the role of the state is very important. So that led to cameralism and a whole school of physical economy, which we also have to consider. Now, we had several conferences with the Schiller Institute about this idea, and we have now, if you look at the conferences and the list of speakers, which is quite impressive, for the last 2.5 years, you can actually see that we are forming an alliance of people who are seriously considering this approach. And naturally, I was asked by many of them to draw up how actually would such a new international security architecture look like. And while I'm not pretending that I'm the only one who can define that, I made a draft about 10 principles which I think must be respected if one wants to have such an international peace architecture. And I want to mention them to you, and I want to encourage to actually read the text because I think it would be incredibly beneficial for the effort to maintain peace and overcome this present war danger if there would be a discussion in the media, in the academia, by professors, by elected officials, former elected officials, and many countries would contribute to say, can humanity actually give itself principles which make our durable survival possible? And I'm very optimistic that it can be done because, we are the human species, we have creative reason, but it does require a much broader discussion than we alone are able to initiate. And therefore, I want to encourage you to look at these principles, and if you agree with them, all the better, republish them. If you have comments, you are welcomed. We will introduce a sub-page in the webpage of the Schiller Institute where we would like to publish any such contributions. So I want to tell you what these principles are, at least in brief form, and please read them extensively. Now, the first principle, how such a security architecture and development architecture should look like, I said it must be implemented by a partnership of perfectly sovereign nation states, the principle of sovereignty. Now, nowadays, that is obviously not the case because we have supranational institutions which take away the sovereignty of nations, like in the case of the European Union. And there you can see that it does not function because, historically, let me just say this very briefly, the principle of sovereignty was a very important conception which had to be developed. It didn't come originally because in Europe, for example, you had the papacy, which is global. Then you had the empires, the Roman Empire and other empires, and it took a long time for even the national monarchies to impose their rights against that supranational structure, the papacy and the empire. And it was only in the 15th century that because of the first nation state with Louis XI in France, you had a sovereign nation state which was characterized by the fact that the living standard of the people doubled in the 20 years of the reign of Louis XI, because for the first time you had the principle that it was not just the elites, the establishment, the nobility and their privileges which counted, but for the first time you had the principle that the common good was supposed to be increased through science and technology and an increase in the urban populations. Now, in the same time, in the 15th century, it was the writings of Nicolaus of Cues, one of the absolute great universal thinkers, who established for the first time in writing the principles of the sovereign state in his writing Concordantia Catholica. And there he developed for the first time the idea that you need a reciprocal legal relationship between the governed and the government. And that is mediated through the representatives who are elected. And these representatives are legally responsible both to the governed and to the government. So the representative system is the only way how the individual can participate in the government. Because a pure democracy does not function. That was already recognized by Plato and by Thucydides, who found that the opposite side of the coin of democracy is tyranny. So basis democracy does not work because you cannot ask 1 million people on every decision, and that develops into anarchy and chaos, and then naturally a tyrant emerges. So obviously this representative idea is extremely important. It does require educated state citizens because only educated state citizens can enforce that principle, and that is the calamity of many of the democracies in the West right now, that formally they are democracies, but they are lacking in educated citizenry, among other things, because the freedom of expression and the freedom of the press is severely hampered. So that's just why I'm putting so much emphasis on the principle of sovereignty, because especially in times of crisis, it is only the sovereign nation state which can protect the interest of the common good. So that is the first principle. The second principle, I say that the first priority must be of these nation states to work together to overcome and end poverty. At a moment when 2 billion people, exactly 1.7 billion people according to the World Food Programme, are threatened with starvation, in the words of David Beasley, who is the director of the World Food Programme. When 1.7 billion people are threatened with world famine, and another 2 billion people lack clean water, it is very clear that their human rights are being deprived in the most obvious way, because poverty is a very severe violation of human rights. And I think the joint collaboration of all nations to work together to overcome poverty, as, for example, China has demonstrated, it can be done. China lifted 850 million people of its own country out of severe poverty, and the middle class is growing from presently about 400 million, estimated to be 600 million very soon. That is something which can be replicated in every single country of the so-called global south. Now, the third principle is the idea to establish a modern health system in every country on earth. The pandemic has shown that only those countries who have functioning health systems could really do something to protect the lives of their citizens. China was again the country which did the most, and you could see that in the case of the United States and Germany and other European nations, that the privatization of the health sector was the basic reason why they did so badly in the fight against COVID. Now, a decent health system is also extremely important for life longevity. If you die early of diseases for which medications already exist, how many people in the developing sector are dying with, diseases which could easily be dealt with if a modern health system was there. So that's the third principle. Now, the fourth principle obviously is that given the fact that we are the creative species, the only known creative species in the universe so far, it is a fundamental right that every human being must be able to develop their creative potential to the fullest. Now, for that you need universal education, and naturally you need circumstances to acquire the knowledge of universal history, of languages, of natural sciences, of the arts. But without that education, people do not have the chance to fulfill the potential all of us have innate within us in the fullest way. Now, the fifth principle, therefore, is the question, how do you finance all of that? And naturally, you need a credit system, which is where the entire purpose of the credit system is to accomplish what I just said in these first points. With other words, the common good, and that man has to be in the middle of the economy and not the profit maximization of a small elite. Now, one reference point is the way the Bretton Woods system was intended by Franklin D. Roosevelt. I know that many countries in the developing sector don't like the Bretton Woods system, but they don't know what was the intention of Roosevelt, who died at the wrong moment, and then the actual Bretton Woods was implemented by Churchill and by Truman, and they kept the colonial structure, while it was the intention of Franklin D. Roosevelt with his idea of the Bretton Woods that the main purpose of the Bretton Woods would have been to overcome poverty and increase massively the living standard in the developing sector. So that is a reference point, and naturally, many countries of the global south, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, and other organizations of the global south are right now already in the process of creating a new credit system, a new international currency. So this is actually on the way. Now, this sixth principle must concern itself with the idea, what is this credit system supposed to do? Namely, to create the precondition for a real development of the global south, always starting with basic infrastructure and then moving to industry, agriculture. And for that, the new Silk Road is right now the practical proposal on the table, and the Schiller Institute since a long time has worked on proposals how the new Silk Road can become the world land bridge, connecting eventually all continents with tunnels and bridges to be, really a new world economic order, making it possible for all human beings to have a decent living standard on the planet. Now, the seventh principle, and now we are moving more into the philosophical underpinnings of these more concrete steps, and that is that geopolitics must be overcome, because geopolitics was the basic reason for 2 world wars in the 20th century, and it embeds the danger of a 3rd world war. That is why we should have a banning of nuclear weapons, because they are so destructive and so deadly that they should absolutely not be tolerated, and of other weapons of mass destruction. Now, the 8th point, in order to overcome geopolitics, people have to learn to think in terms of the one humanity, not thinking in terms of nations against nations, blocks of interest groups against others, but to think the one humanity first. Chinese President Xi Jinping has put it in his words, saying that we have to have the shared community of the one future of humanity. And I have suggested that one should apply the thinking of Nicolaus of Cues, who developed as one of his absolute groundbreaking conceptions the idea of the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites, meaning that there is always a higher one which can be conceptualized by human reason, which is above the many and which has a higher power than the many. Now, if people are supposed to understand that you have to put the one humanity first, well, then you have to get them to train not to think my interest against your interest, and coming back to the phrase of Benito Juarez, the interest of the other implies the interest of all others, meaning the one humanity. So the philosophical discussion of Nicolaus of Cues about the coincidence of opposites, which is a whole big subject in itself, is a very useful way to arrive at that. The 9th principle I have proposed is that we have to, give some depth to this new security and development architecture. And how can we give ourselves principles which are in a way unattackable? Now, I think, and I've thought that since a very long time, that the only way how we will get the world in order eventually is that if we apply the lawfulness of the physical universe, which is reality, to the political, economic, and social order on Earth. And, that this is an idea which is not new. In European philosophy, for example, there was always the idea that there is such a thing as natural law. And, natural law is, according to this tradition, given into the order of creation. It's above the law which is given by man. It is sort of built in the order of creation. And a similar idea you find in many major cultures. For example, in India, it's called that on Earth we have to implement the cosmological order. In China, it's called the mandate of heaven, which must guide politics. So the idea is basically that we should study the lawfulness of the physical universe. And the good thing is that because of modern science, we know more and more about this lawfulness. For example, the great telescopes, the Hubble telescope and recently the James Webb telescope, give us an incredible insight into how the universe looks like. Already the Hubble telescope showed us that there are more than 2 trillion galaxies. Wow. I mean, I find this absolutely mind-blowing because it gives you a sense that you can study this lawfulness and you can draw conclusions about our life on Earth when you do that. And naturally other areas like biophysics or, the incredible perspective of thermonuclear fusion science, what that would do if it could be implemented commercially on Earth in terms of raw material security, in terms of energy security, but also, how the sun functions, how processes function in, controlled plasmas. All of that will give us an insight into the lawfulness of the universe and can guide us in terms of how should we organize our political life. So lastly, the 10th point is probably the most important and I'm sure also the most controversial, because I basically say that man is essentially fundamentally good, and therefore, he can infinitely self-perfect both his creative ability of his mind and the beauty of his soul and his character through studying, through discovery, and through the aesthetical education. Now that is a very fundamentally optimistic image of man, which not many people or not all people share, but I'm absolutely convinced that in that point also Nicolaus of Cus was again right, because he said that evil is not a self-subsisting thing, but it is the lack of development. And I really believe that if you give every child the possibility to have a decent home, to have a loving family, to have access to the kind of education which optimizes all potentials embedded in that child, that there is no reason why people should become evil or greedy or nasty or whatever, but that they will cherish their own creativity more than all the things which we are fighting with today. Because if you look at the really creative people, for example, read the dialogues between Friedrich Schiller and Wilhelm von Humboldt, or Albert Einstein and Planck, and you see that the relationship among human beings can become one where the one loves the other one because of the creative potential she or he expresses, and vice versa, and then you have a really human relationship. So I believe that that is absolutely feasible. And I asked myself many times, Friedrich Schiller, for example, according to whom the Schiller Institute was named 38 years ago, because I believe that the image of man of Friedrich Schiller is so noble that I thought it should have an impact in politics. But Schiller thought that the age of reason was about to come, and many of the humanists of the 18th and early 19th century thought so likewise. And I asked myself many times, why was it that that did not happen? Because I cherish the opinions and views of these humanists very, very high. And I have come to the conclusion that the reason was that science and technology and industry were not yet developed enough to overcome the poverty of the colonial countries or the colonies. And that therefore it was not even an issue. And the most noble ideas of such people as Leibniz or Schiller, it was in the realm of ideas, but the material basis did not yet exist. But now, I think we do have, because of scientific and technological progress, we have the possibility of overcoming poverty for good. There is no reason why one single human being should go hungry or die early because of a lack of medicine. And that, basically, we can build a world where also if you look at the recent technological breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, in digitalization, if these new areas are used for the common good, they will set people free to spend more time on their creative development, and that lifelong learning and lifelong research and being creative will become more and more normal. So I think the idea to really fight for the idea that people see that development is the key to everything. Development is the name for peace. Development is the name to overcome evil, and that we are not bound in a Manichaean world where evil and good will always coexist, but that we can eventually make into cohesion the life of humanity with the lawfulness of the universe, and that therefore, if we act now decisively, we have a very bright future ahead. So I thank you one more time for giving me the opportunity to present these ideas to you. And if you find them in any way agreeable, join us and help us to, really create a new world economic order worthy of the dignity of mankind. Thank you very much.